All right, let's dive into one of the biggest head-scratchers in the book of Exodus. It's a real biblical mystery that honestly feels like a straight-up contradiction. And it all revolves around one guy, the incredibly stubborn ruler of Egypt, Pharaoh. So here's the big question. When Pharaoh just flat-out refused to let the Israelites go, who's really responsible for that? Was it his own choice, his own defiance? Or was he basically a puppet with God pulling the strings, hardening his heart for him? The crazy thing is, the Bible seems to say, well, both.
Okay, so let's break this down. You look at one side of the coin, and you've got verses like Exodus 8:15. It says it right there in black and white. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Seems pretty clear, right? Classic free will. But then you flip the coin over and you hit Exodus 4:21, where God says, "No, I will harden his heart." So what gives? Which one is it? We're going to dig into both sides of this thing.
All right, first up, let's look at the evidence that puts this all on Pharaoh. The text actually gives us a ton of reasons to believe he was making his own conscious choices to stand up to Moses.
Now this verse here is absolutely key. Picture this. The plague of frogs is finally over. There's this moment of relief, a respite. The pressure's off. And in that moment of quiet, what does Pharaoh do? He makes a choice.
And you see how direct the text is? It's not saying some outside force pushed him. Nope, this was his decision. He saw a chance to take back his promise, and he jumped on it. And believe me, this was not a one-and-done deal.
Exactly. Look, it happens again, right after the plague of hail. And pay attention to the wording here. He sinned yet again. This is showing us a clear pattern, right? This is personal, it's repeated defiance. So the case for Pharaoh being his own worst enemy, it's looking pretty strong. But that is only half the story.
So let's switch gears and look at the other side of this. Because for every verse that blames Pharaoh, there seems to be one that points the finger, or at least the responsibility, right back at God.
And boom, here is a verse that just changes the whole game. This isn't God predicting what might happen. This is a statement of fact. He says, I have hardened his heart. God is taking full ownership here, and he even gives a reason why, so he can show off his signs, his power. So you see the shift, right? It feels like the story just pivoted away from Pharaoh's choice and slammed right into God's direct action. And that's the paradox we're here to solve. And guess what? There's even more evidence for this side of the argument.
Yep, here it is again. Plain as day. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. It's not just a random event. It's framed as God following through on his promise. So now we're stuck, right? We have two totally different truths that seem to contradict each other, and both are right there in the scripture.
Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting. Because what if the solution isn't about picking a side? What if it's about understanding how both can be true at the same time? Turns out there's a massive clue, but it's kind of hidden in the original language.
So how on earth can this work? How can Pharaoh harden his own heart, but God also be the one hardening it? Are they like taking turns? Or is there something much deeper going on here? Well, the answer is a big yes, and it's because we're missing a crucial detail in the translation.
The whole key is in the original Hebrew word chazak. Now, when we hear harden, we think of making something bad that was good. But chazak doesn't mean that. It means to strengthen, to fortify, to make something that's already there more resolute, more firm. Think about it. God isn't creating rebellion from scratch. He's just adding concrete to a foundation that Pharaoh himself already poured.
So here's how it really works. Step 1, Pharaoh, all on his own, decides to be stubborn. He initiates the resistance. Then, and only then, comes step 2. God steps in and applies chazak. He basically strengthens and solidifies the decision Pharaoh already made. God's not making the choice, he's just locking it in.
We actually see a really similar idea in the New Testament with Judas. Judas had already made up his mind to betray Jesus. And what does Jesus tell him? What you are about to do, do quickly. See? He's not forcing the betrayal. He's essentially saying, you've made your choice. Now see it through, because it's part of a much bigger plan.
And there's another layer to this. Think about how God uses the circumstances themselves. I mean the plagues. Pressure and suffering can do one of two things to a person, right? It can soften their heart and make them yield. Or it can make them double down, dig in their heels, and get even more bitter. For Pharaoh, the plagues just amplified the defiance that was already in his heart. They acted like a spotlight, exposing and strengthening what was inside him the whole time.
Okay, so now we kind of get the how, but that just brings up an even bigger question. Why? Why would God even bother to strengthen Pharaoh's resolve?
Why not just let him give up after a plague or two? Well, the answer shows us that there was a much, much bigger plan in motion.
When you look at the text, there are really three big reasons. First, this was a massive display of power. It was God showing everyone, especially the Egyptians, that he was way more powerful than any of their gods. Second, it's kind of brilliant. God used Pharaoh's own stubbornness as the very tool for Egypt's judgment. And third, and this is huge for the Israelites, it left no doubt in their minds that God was their deliverer. They weren't freed by diplomacy or by their own power, but by God alone.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. Because this whole story with Pharaoh, it's not just some weird one-off event. It's actually a perfect example of a huge theme you see running through the entire Bible.
And that pattern is this. God has this way of working through and sometimes even using the free will decisions of powerful rulers and entire empires to get his own will done. He's not just reacting to what happens in history, he's actively directing the flow of it.
I mean, the prophet Daniel says it perfectly. He says God is the one who removes kings and sets up kings. He's the one in control of the timeline. Pharaoh, as powerful as he was just one piece on a much, much larger chessboard. So when you boil it all down, here's the big takeaway. The story of Pharaoh is this incredible demonstration of how God's control, his sovereignty, is so complete that he can take our human rebellion, our defiance, and without ever taking away our freedom to choose, he can still weave it perfectly into his grand plan. And that really leaves us with something pretty deep to think about, doesn't it? If the stubbornness of one man, Pharaoh, could end up being the very thing God used to free an entire nation and redirect history, it makes you wonder about our world today. Could it be that even the most rebellious human actions can somehow become tools for a divine purpose that's way bigger than we can see?